Think of a private investigator, and your mind goes to the movies. Trench coats, heavy rain, and a noble detective chain-smoking in the shadows. The real work is much less polished. It involves long hours of waiting in parked cars and documenting the private lives of strangers, a task that, without strict professional oversight, can easily veer into boundary crossing and obsession. To understand how these situations spiral out of control, we use the surveillance triangle. Every case relies on 3 nodes: client, investigator, and target. When ethics bind them, the system works. If one node becomes malicious, the lock shatters, fracturing the triangle. Without that ethical boundary, the transactional nature of the work allows surveillance to be weaponized as a mechanism for exploitation. In the first permutation of a broken triangle, the investigator turns their expertise against the client. This happened to a man who, gripped by a fear that his fiancé was cheating, skipped licensed agencies and hired a man named Shane off Craigslist. Shane arrived at their first meeting in a public park wearing beat-up sweatpants, accompanied by his girlfriend, and immediately began asking intimate questions about the client's home address and private life. Shane took a cash deposit and went silent for a week. Then, at 1:16 in the morning, he sent a text claiming he had news of vital importance and demanded the client meet him immediately at a remote location with the rest of the payment. The address led to an abandoned pitch-black house. Shane texted from inside, telling the client the door was unlocked and to come down into a basement office. Looking into the dark abyss at the top of the stairs, the client realized there was no office, and he fled before he could find out what was actually waiting in the dark. This unregulated corner of the gig economy provides a direct path for predators to lure emotionally desperate people into physical danger. The second breakdown occurs when the client weaponizes the system, directing an attack at the target through the professional investigator. The conflict began when a woman went on a few casual dates with a man named Wade. When she realized there was no connection, she ended the relationship and assumed they would both move on. Soon, she began noticing a gray SUV with tinted windows following her daily routine. She saw it outside her home, at the grocery store, and even idling across the street while she was on a date with someone else. When the police eventually intervened, they discovered the man in the SUV wasn't Wade, but a licensed private investigator. Wade had legally hired a professional to maintain a constant, documented presence in her life. This culminated in Wade ambushing her and her date in a state park, an attack only thwarted because the investigator, who had become concerned by Wade's behavior, had already alerted the police to his instability. Even when following the letter of the law, the tools of private investigation can be used to legitimize a stalker's behavior. In some scenarios, the professional distance between the 3 points vanishes entirely, and the investigator has to take on an active role to prevent a tragedy. A successful businesswoman hired a PI to find Steve, an abusive former investor who had vanished years prior. She didn't want a confrontation. She simply wanted to pay him back and end his psychological hold over her. The investigator tracked the suspect to a foul-smelling makeshift shed hidden in the woods near the client's home. Inside, he found a battered mannequin sitting in a wheelchair. It was wearing a blonde wig to resemble the client, with a photograph of the two of them resting in its lap. In this case, the investigator had to abandon the role of a neutral observer. By calling the police and facilitating an arrest, he stopped a deep-seated obsession from escalating into a physical break-in. These cases show that the idea of an objective observer in the surveillance world is often an illusion. Introducing a third-party human into a volatile, emotional dispute changes the reality for everyone involved, often in ways that are impossible to predict. Long after the physical threat is removed, the psychological impact remains. The targets are often left with a lasting paranoia, that feeling of someone waiting around every corner, making it difficult to ever feel truly safe again. Inviting a stranger to surveil a human life opens a door that is difficult to close. You can never be entirely sure of the motives of the person holding the magnifying glass.